Hi everyone, we are Group H, and in this video, we're going to talk about the introduction to cluster analysis. This is the outline of our report. First is the clustering methods, partitioning method, hierarchical method, density-based method, grid-based method, clustering, quality, and advanced cluster analysis. But first, what is cluster analysis? A clustering is the process of grouping a set of physical or abstract objects into classes of similar objects. A cluster is a collection of data objects that are similar to one another within the same cluster and are dissimilar to the objects in other clusters. A cluster of data objects can be treated collectively as a single group in many applications. Clustering has its applications in many areas, including data mining, statistics, biology, and machine learning. So, cluster analysis is simply grouping a set of objects or data into a new class. So, what are the ways in order to perform cluster analysis? So, next is the clustering methods. Some of the methods that we can use to perform cluster analysis are the partitioning method, hierarchical method, density-based method, and grid-based method. First is partitioning method. Partitioning method, this clustering method classifies the information into multiple groups based on the characteristics and similarity of the data. It's the data analyst to specify the number of clusters that has to be generated for the clustering methods. In partitioning method, when data D that contains multiple N or objects, then the partitioning method constructs user-specified K partitioning of the data in which each partition represents a cluster and a particular region. So next is K-mean. K-mean clustering in unsupervised learning algorithm that is used to solve the clustering problems in machine learning or data science. It allows us to cluster the data into different groups and a convenient way to discover the categories of groups in the unlabeled dataset on its own without the need of any training. It is a centroid-based algorithm where each cluster is associated with a centroid. The main aim of this algorithm is to minimize the sum of distances between the data point and their corresponding clusters. Next is the steps in K-mean algorithm. Step 1 is to select the K to decide the number of clusters. Step 2 is select random K points or centroids. Step 3 is assign each data point to their closest centroid, which will form the predefined K clusters. Step 4 is to calculate the variance and place a new centroid of each cluster. Step 5 is to repeat the third steps, which means we assign each data point to the new closest centroid of each cluster. If reassign occurs, then go to Step 4, else go to finish. Step 7 is the model is ready. This is a sample illustration on a dataset that performed the K-mean, the before and after. Another method is the hierarchical method. So, a hierarchical clustering method works by grouping data objects into a tree-like of clusters. Hierarchical clustering methods can be further classified into agglomerative and divisive hierarchical clustering, depending on whether the hierarchical decomposition is formed in a bottom-up or top-down fashion. So, sa hierarchical method is kinaklasify natin siya na parang tree. And there are two types. It can be a bottom-up or a top-down approach. Next is the Agnes agglomerative hierarchical clustering. This bottom-up strategy starts by placing each object into its own cluster and then merges these atomic clusters into a larger and larger clusters until all the objects are in a single cluster or until certain termination conditions are satisfied. In Diana or divisive hierarchical clustering, this top-down strategy does the reverse of agglomerative clustering. By starting with all the objects in one cluster, it subdivides the cluster into smaller and smaller pieces until each object forms a cluster on its own or until it satisfies the certain termination or condition. So in agglomerative clustering, we begin with each elements as a separate clusters and merge them into successively more massive clusters. And while in divisive clustering, we begin with the whole set of proceed to divide it into successively smaller clusters. Next is we have here also an illustration or the difference between the Agnes and Diana approach. So dito sa agglomerative is from A, B, pinagsama sila into a larger and then A, B, C, D, E. While in divisive is parang general to specific siya.
The next topic is a density-based model. In density-based model, it is a method, one of the clustering methods based on density, the local cluster criterion, such as density connected points. It is a clustering method utilized for separating high-density clusters from low-density clusters. It divides the data points into many groups so that points lying in the same group will have the same properties. So the characteristics of a density-based model, it identifies cluster of any shape in a dataset. It means it can detect arbitrarily shaped clusters. It is based on intuitive notions of clusters and noise. It is very robust in detection of outliers in dataset. It requires only 2 points, which are very insensitive to the order of occurrence of the points in dataset. And number 4, the grid-based method. STING, or the Statistical Information Grid Clustering Algorithm. In this method, the spatial area is divided into rectangular cells. There are several levels of cells corresponding to different level of resolution. The high level is partitioned into several smaller cells in the next lower level. So this is the diagram of the STING hierarchy. We have here the first layer, and so on. Next, the STING algorithm. Number 1, determine a layer to begin with. For each cell of the layer, we calculate the confidence interval or estimated range of probability that this cell is relevant to the query. Number 3, from the interval calculated above, we label the cell as relevant or not relevant. If this is the bottom layer, then end the process. Number 5, we go down the hierarchy structure by one level. Go to step 2 for those levels that form the relevant cells of the higher level layer. Number 6, repeat this process until the bottom layer is reached.
The next is evaluation of clustering. There are important factors by which clustering can be evaluated. These are clustering tendency, number of clusters K, and clustering quality. The first one is clustering tendency. Before evaluating the clustering performance, making sure that the dataset we are working has clustering tendency and does not contain uniformly distributed points is very important. If the data does not contain clustering tendency, then clusters identified by any state-of-the-art clustering algorithm may be irrelevant. Non-uniform distribution of points in dataset becomes important in clustering. The next one is number of clusters K. Some of the clustering algorithms, like K-means, require number of cluster, K as a clustering parameter. Getting the optimal numbers of cluster is very significant in the analysis. If K is too high, each point will broadly start representing a cluster. And if k is too low, then data points are incorrectly clustered. Finding the optimal numbers of cluster leads to granularity in clustering. The third one is clustering quality. There are majorly two types of measure to assess the clustering performance. The first one is the extrinsic measure, which require ground truth label. Examples are adjusted rand index, Fowler-Mallow score, mutual information based score, homogeneity, completeness, and B measure. The second one is the intrinsic measure that does not require ground truth label. Some of the clustering performance measures are silhouette coefficient, Kalinski-Harabas index, and Davis-Baldwin index, etc. Another topic is the advanced cluster analysis. Cluster analysis is the task of segregating a set of objects with similar characteristics and assign them into different clusters. Some of the advanced topics of clustered analysis are probabilistic model-based clustering, clustering high-dimensional data, clustering graph and network data, and clustering with constraint. The probabilistic model-based clustering. It is a useful framework for clustering data in a statistical context. This framework can be directly extended to the clustering of sequential database for finite mixture of sequential model. A hidden category probabilistic cluster which is a distribution over the data space which can be mathematically represented using probability density function or a distribution function. Probabilistic model-based clustering is widely used in many data mining applications such as text mining. In the example, the image suggests at least 3 clusters in the mixture. The shape of each of 3 clusters appears to be approximately elliptical, suggesting 3 bivariate normal distribution. As the 3 ellipses seems to be similar in terms of volume, shape, and orientation, we might anticipate that the 3 components of the mixture might have homogeneous covariance matrices. That's all, thank you.